Well, good afternoon,
Hello.
everybody. We are beginning our webinar. This afternoon's webinar on discernment and learning, teaching discernment, brought to you by CCMA. Uh, this afternoon, Dr. Melanie-Prejean Sullivan has been the Director of Campus Ministry at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky since 2000. She holds a master's degree in history and counseling student affairs and in theological studies. Before becoming a campus minister, she was an archivist, a museum collections manager, an international sorority academic advisor, and high school humanities teacher and counselor. She's a graduate of St. Maidenred School of Theology in Louisville. I said that right because my daughter lived there, Louisville. Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Melanie's doctoral research focused on ways in which we can teach elements of discernment to undergraduates. Most recently, she was a recipient of the NetView, or Network for Vocational Undergraduate Education grant, where she co-facilitated a cohort of faculty to teach discernment across the disciplines in literature, health sciences, philosophy, theology, theater, and the cross-curricular core. Melanie is certified by and serves as a committee member of the Catholic Campus Ministry Association. She has taught for the Frank J. Lewis Institute for New Campus Ministers and teaches an introduction to campus ministry at St. Maidenred School of Theology. So welcome, Melanie, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Welcome, everyone. I hope that this next hour or so will be something that will be filled with some enjoyment and that you'll learn a little bit something or a new way of looking at something that you already know. They asked me to create this webinar for you based on some conversations that we've had over the years, both at the Frank J. Lewis and then conversations with other campus ministers about the ideas surrounding the concept of the term discernment and what that meant. So a little bit of background. As Frank mentioned, I did my research for my doctorate on discernment, and perhaps I could explain a little bit more that discernment for me was sort of a mysterious word, and there was sort of this implication that it was a gift of the Holy Spirit that only a few people had. It was, if you're a product of the 1960s, discernment was only something that people who were discerning a call to religious life or priesthood could practice, but that it was sort of mysterious, and you either got it or you didn't get it. You just knew it or you didn't know it. And after a couple of years in campus ministry, I began looking at my own vocation story, and I realized that I had been using the term even when I was thinking about religious life, but I never really understood it, and that there must be some other way to capture it. In fact, I use the metaphor to say that teaching discernment to students who are trying to make these big life decisions that they make in college is a lot like trying to teach somebody how to start and stop on the ice when all they really want you to teach them is pirouettes so they can get an Olympic gold medal in ice skating. That there must be some basic elements that we could transmit to them and question and encourage them in ways that would help them to be lifelong discerners and to use discernment in more ways than just the one big career or vocation decision. So the first thing I would say for today is since we're all learning outcome and assessment oriented on college campuses, is what do I hope that we will accomplish today? And first, I would say that we would understand what discernment is as an effective means of making important decisions. The little quote that follows there on the slide is really one of my favorite quotes. I've said for years that I'm going to cross-stitch it and put it in my office, but really knowing what to do, knowing when to stay in something and when to walk away, and when to run in a direction that takes us in a completely new place, to a completely new place. We're going to look at a couple of different discernment models, or really what I would call elements of discernment, and then hopefully some practical experience that we might be able to transmit to our students. For the purposes of today's course webinar, this is how I have defined discernment. And you'll see that I highlighted it in red those places that I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about. But that discernment is a process. It's not one and done. It's not finished. It's a quotidian kind of thing. It's not unlike eating or sleeping. You can't do it once and for all. That it's a repetitive kind of process that we go through, sometimes very serious, crucial decisions, sometimes a little bit lighter decisions, not just what to have for dinner, but whether to eat healthy or not, and what those kinds of processes are and how they translate with individuals when they're rooted in prayer, and that the God language has to be part of this conversation, and that we're encouraged to use God language when we're talking about this, and not to merely reduce important decisions to a yellow pad with a pro and a con column where you make a decision almost like tossing a coin. And so that discernment is an invitation that we send literally to God, asking God to show up. When I first started looking at this, I looked at the different ways in which we can, and usually, for instance, on retreats, or in classes, we invite students, we invite God into the conversation. And so I was thinking, you know, as a teacher, we do it with journaling. As coaches, we might coach students in their prayer life. We might act as spiritual companions with them. We might be mentors with them. Sometimes they share their confidences with us, and we even become somewhat their protectors. But all the time that we are doing whatever it is we're doing as teachers or companions or mentors, we are always teaching students to do it for themselves. That is to say, we facilitate their personal development. We don't do it for them. One of the things that I did throughout this first project that I had in the doctoral class was to set up different elements of the class where they would invite God into conversation. So writing a spiritual autobiography, writing theological reflections, engaging in a regular prayer life, creating a rule of life for themselves in terms of prayer. But in each one of these, I said, you know, the way that you approach this very much has to do with your orientation toward the divine. And so I created this little exercise that I used to call, "What is your theology?" And I have these two pictures on the slide. One is, I guess, an image of the Bible, as if the Word of God is literally shining off of the page, and that our understanding of God is rooted in some written tradition, and that in terms of being written, it's somewhat linear, and it goes from point A to point B in a story. But that for many of us, the experience of God is much more like the picture on the right, which is the eye of a hurricane off the coast of Louisiana, which is my home state, and that it's not at all linear. That it's a spinning kind of a thing. That life is, there may be some calm in the midst of it, but toward the edge of that hurricane, there are all kinds of tornadoes that spin off from it, and sometimes God in our lives feels unsettled. And then sometimes the tragedies of life or the hurricanes of life actually have us questioning whether God is there at all. And so how much does God play a role in our day-to-day life? Are we pawns on a chessboard? Do we manipulate? Do we treat God like a divine butler? This is what I want you to do, and then I want you to disappear. How are our theologies at work, and how do we see God's role in our lives? And so the adjective, noun, verb exercise that I referred to there is one where I ask students to pretend for a moment that I am Melanie the Martian, who just came into your office to ask you for some help. I've been studying your language for quite a long time, and I understand nouns and verbs pretty well, and even adjectives. But what I'm not getting is this abstract concept and this word that you keep using, God. And I say to you, can you give me some Martian translation or some English reduced translation for this Martian to understand. And I have students write on a piece of paper 3 nouns that they would use to describe God, which of course would be metaphors. So you might do that very quickly with them in an exercise. You might even do it yourself right now. The reason you do it quickly is if you look at the words for very long, or you ruminate on them for very long, you'll find yourself judging and correcting and wanting to put the perfect answer down. And I say to students, it has to be spontaneous. Do it fast. What do you think of as a noun when you think of God? So now I'm the Martian again, and I'm looking at your 3 nouns, and I say, okay, well, this kind of makes sense. I know what each of these nouns means in English. I understand you're saying it's a metaphor because you've never actually met this being. But tell me something more about this being using some descriptor or some adjective, or something that explains in a verbal way how this being operates, behaves, encounters you. Explain that a little bit more. And so you do that quickly as well. Quickly, 3 adjectives. And now you end up, let's say, with 3 descriptors and 3 nouns. And you might line them up like this. So students will say parent, friend, creator. Those are the nouns. Merciful, loving, generous. Those are the descriptors. Then you take each of the descriptors and each of the nouns and you pair them with each other. And you end up with the 9 phrases in italics that you have underneath at the bottom of the screen there. And then I say to them, but you told me you believed in one God. There are 9 theologies on this page. And if we have 12 people on this conference call, webinar, and there are 9 theologies on each of our pages, then there's the capacity for us to have about 100 different theologies just in this webinar. And then, of course, you look at them very closely and you realize that the God that you pray to is on this list, but the God that you pick from this list is going to depend on your situation. If you are feeling very guilty about something, then you're going to want the merciful, oh, I see a typo, merciful parent or the merciful friend or the merciful creator. Other times of our lives we just want a loving friend. Sometimes we need God to give us a little bit more time, a little bit more energy, a little bit more enthusiasm, a little bit more love, and we're going to go after the generous creator to give us what we need. And so that our theologies shift and change somewhat in our prayer life, depending on what our wish list is on that prayer life. But mainly to understand that our theologies, although they are varied, none of them is to be judged as wrong, and that what our understanding of discernment is that it's not a game of chance. I mean, it's not an accident that I have all of these theologies. I have learned them over the years, and as I've learned them over the years, I've gone into a more deliberate relationship with that God that I love greatly, who can be described in so many different ways. And I have conversations. I invite that God into conversation. And really, that is the essence of what discernment is paying attention and listening. Of course, at this point, too, we've moved students away from thinking that prayer is what we say, and helping them to understand that prayer is also how we listen. That when we say that we are prayers, we're not simply talking about reciting prayers, although that is a legitimate way of being, that sometimes it involves listening carefully or reading between the lines. At this point, I went back to this definition and sort of divided up the class into a couple of different segments. And this is what I also do when I'm doing retreats or working with students individually. Having them or inviting them to tell their story and listening to their individual stories will tell you something about their theology. You might, in fact, ask them to tell you what their favorite biblical story is, and then to tell you who they are in that story. You might ask them to go back to their earliest memories and to begin to tell their stories and show how their own understanding of God has changed over the years. So to begin that exercise, I'm just going to go forward and then I'll come back a little bit. I do a spiritual autobiography exercise where I ask them to think back to their earliest memory, and usually this is something that they will remember from when they were 3 or 4 years old. And I caution them to be very careful that that memory is actually a memory of who they are. I often tell the story that apparently when I was 3 years old, my grandfather had a Studebaker, a sports car with a horsehair carpet. It was the 1950s and there were no seat belts, and we were driving along together. I was in the passenger seat and someone ran a stop sign and he slammed on the brakes. And when he did, I skidded forward on that horsehair carpet and really skinned my knees and my shins. And I stood up, and instead of just crying, I straightened out my dress, pointed my finger at him, and told him explicitly that grandfathers who drive Studebakers should not slam on their brakes when their granddaughters are in the car. And then I sat down very indignant. Now, anybody who knows me knows that's probably true. I probably did exactly that. But I don't really remember that story. I only know that story because it was told to me with a lot of laughter at almost every family reunion we had, because it explained to a lot of people something about my personality. So when I'm talking to students, I'll tell them that story, but I'll say, it's not my memory. That's my grandfather's memory. What is your earliest memory? And to have them go back to that earliest happy, safe place memory and to ask themselves questions about all the 5 senses. What did it smell like? What did it feel like? What sounds were in the room, or was it outside? What season was it? Anything that's going to evoke a reaction from the senses that's going to pull them back to that place. And I have them sit in that place for quite a long time, describing everything they remember about that age and in that place. And once they're back in that place, then they ask the question, who is God? So what does your 3-year-old or your 4-year-old self, how does your 3 or 4-year-old self define who God is? And then you repeat these steps again at about kindergarten, which is a great time of awakening. And then you repeat it again at age 10, because when we are 10, our worldview is formed. When I was 10 years old, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I remember being profoundly affected by the fact that somebody killed the only Catholic president. And then I remember being affected by the news in Louisiana that maybe it wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald. Maybe, in fact, it was government agencies that wanted him silenced. And so I question authority to this very day. I'm not sure about people's motives to this very day. When I was 10, that event affected my world view. If you have a student who was 10 during 9/11, that drastically affects their world view, and they probably cease to see the world as a safe place, or at least as safe a place as I thought it was growing up. And then for college students, again, about 15, and then maybe today, if they're 20 or something. And that as they're telling their story and writing their spiritual autobiography, they're considering all of their doubts, their emotions, their anger. They question when they stopped believing certain things, how certain things changed, and also what is the same about their theology. And so once they've come across this concept, this progressive understanding of themselves, and trace their expanding understanding of their relationship with God, I think then they're able to tell their own story. So if we go back, this telling your story, that is the individual. Then we want them to be rooted in prayer, and we want them to begin to think theologically beyond that what is your theology exercise. We really want them to look at the way other people have told their stories. And so that's when I usually go back to the tradition and teach students how to write a theological reflection, how to take this intersection of the experience that they're having, what the tradition says about it, and what the culture seems to say about it, and how those things intersect. What kind of an aha moment do they have when those three things come together? This is also when, of course, I rely on quotes or books that were written about from within our tradition. Things certainly at Bellarmine we anchor everything in our spiritual mentor Thomas Merton, who basically said to be a saint means to be myself, and then discovering myself in discovering God. It's a double process. That the more you learn about God, the more you learn about yourself, and the more you move into the true self and away from the false self, the more you become visible to God. There's a story in one of his journals about this notion that God does not even recognize our false selves because they don't exist. And so having students play with this and think about this helps them to see themselves in a new light, hopefully, to adjust the lens that they're using to focus in their own lives. And the more they know about themselves and the more they come to know about God, the more they're engaging in, well, this is what I think God wants for me. Or they begin to notice, I wonder if God wants this for me. Or is this something God is telling me? Or paying attention to specific methods to think theologically. There's a great discernment article from April the 7th in America Magazine by James Martin, which explains, it's a lovely synopsis of Ignatian spirituality as he's looking at the latest apostolic exhortation and what Pope Francis means as a Jesuit by using the term discernment. And this is probably also a time to mention that we sometimes find people in our lives who believe that discernment, as I mentioned in the early part, is only something that a few choice people can do. And to extend that, it can only happen on a 30-day Ignatian retreat in silence with a spiritual director, that it's out of reach. I think one of the things that James Martin does, Father Martin does in this discernment article is really talk about ways in which it's discernment is very approachable. The biblical narrative note that I have here is something from a writer, a Reverend Draper, who uses that biblical narrative perspective that I mentioned a little bit earlier, where you ask people to tell you their favorite story in the Bible and the person they are in that story. But it also, in most conversations I've had, gives you a very clear picture of the God that they believe in, whether it's a judgmental God, a punishing God, a loving God, a soft-spoken God. Those biblical narratives that are their favorites tell you a lot about their theology. And sometimes we, as facilitators, are listening to those stories, and we are the ones who point out things that they may not recognize themselves when they're telling those stories. Sometimes we do discernment in groups, and we look at great classics like the Rule of St. Benedict for how to live together in a community, and what different roles we have within that, and seeing ourselves in community, decision-making and discernment. And then, of course, stories from the tradition. And these are 6 examples that I use from the biblical narrative to talk about ways in which individuals were told or heard the call, and how they rose to the occasion. And, of course, the Samuel story with Eli, the concept of having that whisper to repeat over and over, the fact that it was so quiet that Samuel didn't even recognize whose voice it was, but that it took a wisdom figure to point out to Samuel, I think God's trying to tell you something. Just say, speak, your servant is listening. For some of us, it means getting thrown off of a horse, or a sudden jolt like Paul had for his understanding. For some, it's understanding and discovering our identity in the face of power and in the face of prejudice, like in Judith or Esther's case. Matthias, I think, is always fun because you think, oh, the disciples were all these holy men who sat around praying, and they figured out who was going to replace Judas, and in fact, they just rolled the dice. And then, of course, the Luke story where Mary says yes, and the idea that after our discernment comes the need for a response, and if the response is yes, then we're given even more grace than we could imagine to make that decision happen. The next thing we talk about in discernment is asking the right questions. I think for most of our students, it's so unsettling to have people ask them over and over again, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to major in? And there's so many choices now. I think there are thousands more choices than there were when I was in school. And in fact, they say that most of our students, when they reach our age, will have the option of careers that haven't even been created yet. So the choices are not going to diminish. They're probably going to increase. And so the more options you have, the harder the choice. So what do you want to be when you grow up? I think it's helpful if you switch it and say, what are you called to do with your life? I was having a conversation with a priest friend recently about some of our students that just seem to be miserable because they can't make up their minds what they're going to do next. And he laughingly said to me, what in the world makes them think that they have to be happy? Why can't they just choose to do something and do it? Why can't they see all that has to be done in the world and just do it? And I wonder about that sometimes. Where have we placed a burden on our children and our students and our future on this notion of happiness? And does happiness, is it a guarantee? And if they think they're not happy in their first year of work, they're supposed to quit and go back and get a third master's or a second master's or whatever, because they have to find happiness out there. Isn't it probable that they, if they're in the right place doing the right thing, that happiness is going to follow? So without getting off on too much of a tangent, whose dream is this for them? Are they studying pharmacy because mom and dad insisted that that would be a great way for them to make a living? Or do they really have an aptitude and a love for the science that's behind this and for the capacity to heal? Sometimes what they don't want is just as important. A friend of mine took the traditional inventory back in the 80s, and he was good at math and good at computer science, and so he became a programmer, and he was so miserable in his first 6 months on the job, and he couldn't figure out why, because he loved crunching the numbers and he loved playing with the computer, but he hated being in a cubicle by himself. That was not his personality. So what he knew he didn't want was to work alone. And that was just as important as the career field, the atmosphere. What do you know of yourself from hindsight? What do you know of yourself from perspectives other people say? I say to students all the time, if someone says, you're such a good listener, or you're such a good teacher, or you have such a gift for making things understandable, that's communicating something to you about your call. The gifts and talents that you have are sometimes the places that point you into the next place. The other little tidbit that I sometimes use is to remind them that the field is not necessarily the work. So for instance, I have a student who thought for a long time he wanted to be a youth minister. In his junior year, he was taking some business classes, and he really was enjoying them. And he came to see me, and I asked him, what was going on, and he said, I don't think it's theology anymore. I'm afraid it's business. I said, what do you mean you're afraid it's business? Well, he said, I just love the business so much. He goes, I still love the theology, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make a living, and I would like my wife to be able to stay home with our children in the early years. I'm not sure I'll be able to afford that if I go into youth ministry. I said, well, now you're asking economic questions. So let's keep them lined up, and let's talk about this. But let's go back to why you're afraid of business. And he said, well, I just always thought of theology as the opposite of business. That people who were in business were in it to make money, and people who were going to study theology and go into youth ministry were doing it because they were following God. I said, so you think you can't do a ministry in business, right? And he said, yeah. And I said, I have an idea. I want you to go interview a friend of mine who's a CPA for a nonprofit organization. Don't you believe that since the collapse of 2008 and all the corruption that we saw that caused that collapse, we need honest CPAs auditing the books? Isn't it possible that that's a call? Isn't it possible that a call to bring people toward honest accounting is just as significant as a call to be a youth minister? Well, no. I mean, I said, one works with what? And he said, well, I guess you're right. They both work with people. I had another student who was floundering, and he ended up going into human resources when he realized that he loved teaching, but he didn't want to grade papers, but he loved helping people be the best they could be. And so by being in human resources, he could teach time management, and he could also help them make decisions about how to be a better manager, how to be a helpful evaluator, and also how to choose the right insurance policy for their family. So all of these so-called business fields that some of our students want to put in the other category as opposed to ministry, sometimes we have to help them reorganize their thoughts and rethink what they're thinking, and see where they've been somewhat narrow-minded. Sometimes that means we have to teach them to slow down. This metaphor, the V or the U, comes from a book called Presence by a man named Peter Senge, S-E-N-G-E, and his friends. And they wrote this book as a narrative of some decisions that they were making. And they have this metaphor for resting at the bottom of the U. And so if you're making a decision that's a V decision, you're collecting information, writing it down, making pro and con lists, interviewing people, getting statistics together, and then you're sitting for a second, making that decision, and whoops, you've made the decision. Now you might stop back and evaluate it, but basically you came to a point when you made the decision. The U, on the other hand, is this letter that gives us a place to rest for a long time at the bottom. So you collect information, you let go of some information, you collect some information, and then you sit with what you think is going to be your decision for some time. You rest at the bottom of the U, and then the decision emerges more gradually until you have that aha moment of discernment. So this is just one metaphor, that sometimes visual metaphors that help students to understand what I'm talking about by discernment, and contrasting it to a point V or a V letter kinds of decision. The other thing that is, I think, so critical when we're talking about discernment is that it's a lifelong journey where we continue to learn more and more and more about ourselves. And so lots of resources out there for where we can make that happen. And so this is one list. The National Religious Vocation Convocation has several publications, but Vision Magazine is one that I make sure that I have around the office every year, because there are always a lot of great articles in there on discernment, written usually by young members of religious communities and how they reached this point in their lives. I really love that magazine. I think it's just a wealth of information, and I can't bear to part with it at the end of every year. I keep a back copy, because even though the next year is lovely, there's always something to hold on to. Their Horizon magazine is also very helpful for those of us who are walking the vocational counseling path with our students. Frank mentioned in the beginning that I was a recipient of a NetView grant. The Council on Independent Colleges has a network for vocational undergraduate education. If your college or university is not part of this, I would heartily, if you're an independent college, definitely recommend that you find out about this. They have a semi-annual conference, and they are funded by Lilly and have done some remarkable things helping us talk the vocational language across the disciplines. And we used it here at Bellarmine. We used vocational language to teach a literature course that contrasted or compared Merton and the Transcendentalists, specifically Thoreau. We certainly use it in our Intro to Philosophy class, of the Socratic understanding of knowing yourself, and we used it in theater. We used it in nursing and health sciences to look at the body-mind-spirit connection. We used it in our interdisciplinary core as a history class to teach how other cultures make decisions. For instance, comparing an arranged marriage to a so-called love marriage. What are the differences? How do we make decisions based upon our culture? Do we defer those decisions to other people, or do we make them ourselves? All of these ideas have been compiled into a curriculum guide that followed my doctoral work that I used with our campus. It's called Whispers, Nudges, and a Couple of Kicks. The title comes from a conversation I had with Sister Melanie-Prejean when we were talking about how she knew she was called to do work against the death penalty. And she was talking to me about discernment, and I said I was thinking about calling my book Whispers after the Samuel and Eli story, and she said, oh no, you need to call it Whispers, Nudges, and a Couple of Kicks, because sometimes God has to knock us off of our comfort place a little bit before we pay attention and understand. But the whole point of the semester was to get students to a point where they could create their own discernment model. It might have some elements of Ignatian spirituality in it. It might have some elements of biblical stories like putting out the fleece or the Samuel story. It might have all kinds of different steps or stages or elements, but that at the end of it they needed to look at their own personality and figure out how they best would discern. Did it need to be on a mountain retreat, or could it be in the middle of a long walk in the local park? Did it need to be sitting down journaling? Did it need to be a combination of those things? How to find a spiritual director, the right spiritual director. And then just in the last couple of weeks, when you start thinking about something, and this is, I think, Holy Spirit, things cross your desk. Unbelievable things cross your desk. And I was listening in to a conversation with a career, actually another webinar a couple of weeks ago, and these two websites, the Motivational Core and the Jobsology websites, these are tools that are being used by our career centers, and they're doing some of the same things that I just talked about in the last 40 minutes or so, helping students to figure out who they are by using things that already exist, like StrengthsFinder or the Myers-Briggs type inventory or the strong interest inventory or measuring their emotional quotients, using all kinds of ideas to create stories, and then using those stories, loading them into some software program, and the story pulls out your most commonly used words or ideas and creates a word cloud or ribbons that show you in very clear graphic ways what you're saying, and help you have these aha moments. I hadn't realized I was so focused on that, or I hadn't realized I was thinking so much about that. So those are two other websites that I would refer you to, and really strongly suggest that you look at those with someone from your career center so that the students can understand that it's not a vocational conversation with you and a career conversation with the career center, that it's a combination conversation with everyone. And of course it's helpful to have people from the career center talk to you about their methodology and their understanding. The graphic that I have on here is Moses, and I particularly put him here to remind us that when we think about Moses and the burning bush, we have to remember that story that God did not speak to Moses until he stopped to look at the bush. And he had to notice that something was important. He had to stop and look. He had to be quiet and listen. And that's when God spoke to him. And so helping students to understand that while they're having a meltdown and a cry session, that God's not going to be able to get through. They need to stop and pay attention. They need to be quiet and to be centered. And then we help them look for other places where there might be fingerprints of God. This is a term that Ben Campbell Johnson uses in his book on hearing God's call, where he shows us that we look for ways to be reassured that God's voice is involved in this, and frequently involves some sort of a spiritual peace. This makes sense. Our shoulders naturally relax. We begin to sleep better. We begin to feel more comfortable with decisions that we have discerned rather than made with a throw of the dice or a list on a yellow page. And so in closing, if any of you have questions, please get them to Frank, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. But I close with this last quote from Merton that is, "For me to be a saint means to be myself. The problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and of discovering my true self." Our students who come to us for holiness training really are involved in discernment training. That is where they find themselves. We are frequently quoted around here as saying, to be holy, you have to be whole. And you have to be able to recognize those places where you've been wounded and also those places where you've been strong, and to be able to humbly look at yourself planted on the ground. So that's the end of my remarks. Frank?
Okay, thank you, Melanie. Any questions, please send them over. I'm going to open up the microphone on the vocation office that's listed here because it says, "Can you make me the presenter?" So I'm not sure what they're asking, but I'm unmuting vocation office. Go ahead, please. Did you have a question? Okay. Anybody else would like to ask a question? You can either type the question in the space and send it to me, the presenter. Send it to me as the organizer, or let me know. Just say I have a question. I'll open up your microphone. Okay, well, I believe you did a great job of getting all the information out that they wanted. So if there are any other, thank you. Let's see, Claire says, thank you. How do you recommend utilizing this on a state campus at a Newman Center? Presentations, one-on-one?
Actually, we've had a lot of success doing this on a 3-day retreat where we divided these into different activities throughout a Friday night, and then Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday morning, and ended with Mass. We have done just days of discernment where we would do 2 or 3, like we choose one activity and we do it all day Saturday, like a spiritual autobiography, or writing our spiritual autobiography, or writing a theological reflection, or journaling prompts. It's very helpful to give them journaling prompts where they ask the same questions over and over again over a period of a couple of weeks, and then we might go on a retreat and they'll share on a day of reflection, rather, if they can't do an overnight. I found those effective. Yes, sometimes it is one-on-one, and it runs a little bit like behavior modification therapy, where you give them a little homework and then they bring it back, or they send you a journal entry and you do almost like a verbatim that you would do in CPE, where you'd say, I see you say this here, tell me more about what that means. Or I hope that's helpful. But we've had quite a bit of success doing this. We blend it sometimes with the University of Louisville, which is a Catholic campus ministry group, but a state campus, and do mornings away, weekends away, evenings away on discernment. Did that help?
So vocation office, the question, you said I missed the first part of the presentation. Is there a way to access the presentation, or better yet, the presentation with the audio? Yes, there is. CCMA will send out the link to this particular webinar. Melanie also presented a similar webinar last week, so both of them will be there. And they are somewhat different, having been at both of them, so you may want to watch both. But going back to Claire, if you any follow-up question that you might have to Melanie's response. Okay. Any other questions? Let's see. We're just getting thank yous and excellence. So I'll ask one more time before we do wrap up. Make sure everybody's had the opportunity to ask questions.
I did see someone asked if they could get the slides. Having found 2 or 3 typos today that I've never seen before, I'm going to fix it, send it to Krista, and she'll repost it, I'm sure.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So given that, we'll wrap this up. Again, thank you to Melanie for her presentation once again this week. Please be sure to watch your email for more webinars in May and June. And if you should have any topics that you wish to learn more about or are interested in presenting a webinar, please contact the National Office of CCMA with your ideas. You can send Krista Bollinger a email at bollinger@ccmanet.org or call her at 513-842-0167. Thanks for attending. This will be available, like we said, online. And I just got another question here before we do end it. Is there someone I could contact as a resource in regards to the retreats that Melanie is speaking about?
The retreats that we do, we follow the curriculum, which I sort of outlined today. I mean, how to teach students how to write a spiritual autobiography, teach them how to do a theological reflection, encourage them to journal. For example, asking the same questions. What am I most grateful for today? What am I least grateful for today? Curcio type questions. When was I Christ for someone else today? When was someone Christ for me today? Just making them aware of that presence of God in their lives. Asking the same questions over and over again and getting a different response is more helpful than Dear Diary. Today I blah, blah, blah. So a lot about journaling prompts. But we just follow that, we kind of follow that curriculum, which I outlined for you here. So I don't like shameless plugs, but we do have the book available. The Office of Campus Ministry printed it, and it's available through Campus Ministry here. It's not on Amazon, but if you're interested at all, it's $19.95 plus shipping and handling, and it's a curriculum for a semester, but it also has examples of how to break it down for a 3-day retreat or a 1-day seminar and that sort of thing.
So Melanie, what would be the email address? I'm sorry, the URL. Would it be bellarmine.edu?
You could just get it, yes, you can just send it to Campus Ministry as one word at bellarmine.edu. That's the easiest, most direct. Thank you, Frank.
And not a shameless plug when it comes from me. So, thank you. And Claire says thank you. So, any other questions before we sign off? All right. Well, thanks again. I hope everything's great over there in Louisville. And thank you for being with us. And thank you all. And I'm not sure if you're a Cursiista or not, but de colores. And take care. And we'll see you at the next CCMA webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.